Greetings and welcome to Trinity Radio for the third time today as we were trying to sort out tech issues. But if you end up seeing this stream, then blessings on you and may your children rise up and call you blessed. I am joined today by Eric Hernandez, who is the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists. And so he is in charge of the Unapologetics Conference, of organizing that, and that's a conference I've spoken at several times, and love it. And Eric has been a friend for a while. In fact, it's an interesting story about how I actually first met you, Eric. The first time I met you in person was before I had debated Matt Dillahunty, after you had debated Matt Dillahunty, I think, and you showed up at the Unapologetics Conference and walked in with Matt Dillahunty and sat in my breakout session. And I thought you were an atheist. I thought, here's this. I mean, he looks like an atheist. If anybody looked like an atheist, it's Eric Hernandez. And so, but we became friends at that conference. And then in subsequent breakouts, you showed up, and we have hanged out and collaborated and helped each other prepare for debates ever since. So I'm really honored to have you here, Eric.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you, and I'm glad the connection's doing good.
So far, so good. And in fact, Mike Winger, I'm trying to figure out how to make these things. Yeah, Mike Winger says, "Oh no, it's Eric." So anyway, you got some fans out there. Now, let's jump right in. So we're here today to talk about the nature of the soul and whether or not we have them. And I was looking at, so yeah, this actually came to my mind, Eric, because I've been looking at the news stories about the coronavirus, and I've heard several people say things like how to something to do, how to take care of your soul in the midst of the coronavirus. And I thought, man, there's a growing number of people in the U.S. who don't even believe we have a soul. And so I need to have Eric on and let's talk about this. And interestingly, there were recent comments by HolyKoolaid, who is a YouTuber, an atheist YouTuber, and also comments by physicist Sean Carroll on a specific element of the soul issue, and that has to do with what is called the interaction problem. And the interaction problem, Eric can explain for us, but because of the problems seen with this, or the proposed problems that we see with the interaction problem, Sean Carroll would go so far as to say science has demonstrated that we do not have souls. Which seems like an interesting thing for science to think they have any business talking about. But why don't you explain that for us? And then in a minute, we're going to go to some video clips.
Yeah, so the interaction problem is it typically poses an objection to the existence of the soul, and it's basically the question that if the soul does exist, then one would have to provide an account of how something immaterial can interact with something physical, and the alleged objection is basically that if you cannot account for that, or if there's reason to believe that that can't happen, or if we have no examples of this, then it would, depending on who's asking or who's posing this alleged objection, they'll usually say, well, then there is no soul, kind of like the way Carroll is actually going to pose his objection here. But as our good friend Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity likes to remind us, questions are not arguments. So to ask of how the soul interacts with the body, if it exists, even I like to first point out, even if I can't answer the question, it doesn't follow that therefore there is no soul, or that somehow it makes a soul unintelligible. In fact, in my debate with Tom Jump, he brought this up, and I pointed the same thing out that I just said, that when you ask an epistemic question of how something works, it doesn't follow that ontologically speaking, the thing that we're questioning doesn't exist. I've heard other people say, just because I don't know how my car works doesn't mean I can't drive it. So you have a difference in questioning whether or not something exists, and then the question of how something works if it exists. And the primary question for this topic of whether or not the soul exists should be that very question. Does it exist? Do we have reasons to believe it exists? And anything that would follow after that would be secondary issues, not the primary issue.
Yeah, Eric, a related issue that comes up a lot of the time when we talk about the soul is the nature of human freedom, which both you and I have done a lot of work on. And when someone challenges me on, from ultimately one of the more difficult issues to address with free will, libertarian freedom, is what is called, or is the question of from whence does a free choice come? Like, did you do it because you wanted to, and didn't those wants and reasons ultimately determine that you would do whatever thing? And I give a similar answer, at least to this much. Hey, even if it were the case, and I don't think this is the case, but even if it were the case that I couldn't explain to you how it is that a free choice is made, it doesn't mean that libertarian freedom isn't possible. Just like I don't know how my car works. I put the key in, I turn it on, it does work. So I think that's a relevant thing that people need to keep in mind when they consider some of these things. There is no contradiction in the idea of us having souls. There is no contradiction in the idea of us having libertarian freedom. And I think both of those things are important. If there were a contradiction, we'd have to say, yeah, the game's over for us. But there is no contradiction. So are we on the same page there?
Absolutely, yeah. It again goes back to, if something exists, my inability to explain how it works doesn't invalidate the fact that it does exist. These are two separate questions that we have to keep in mind, and to confuse the two just shows either one doesn't understand the topic in question, or one is just trying to find. In other words, it's easy to say, okay, this is a great, strong case, but what about this really hard question? And if you play Stump the DJ, where you're just going to keep asking questions until you find the one question that the person hasn't spent 10 hours plus of studying on, then sure, you might be able to get a pat on the back or something. But when we're focusing on the topic of discussion of whether or not something exists, that should be the primary focus.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, we're going to jump into a section of video here in a moment, and hopefully it will work. And second, if you have a question for Eric or for me, then you just tag our name when you write the comment, and hopefully I will see it. We are using, as I said, new software that hopefully will make the show better. But this is one of those moments where we're experiencing a teething process, and so not everything is going to work perfectly. So please bear with us in that. But all right, we're going to look at something from HolyKoolaid now. And this has to do with a problem that might come, and an example given from twins that are conjoined twins. So to this point in the video, what HolyKoolaid has said is, he's like, look, if we have souls, then how does this make sense of the fact that some people are born conjoined twins, where they're still connected physically at the head or at some other part of the body? And that raises some interesting questions. So I'll just play the clip and we can respond to it.
I have nothing but respect for these adorable children, but cases like this underline the absurdity of the notion of the soul. What if one believes in Allah and the other in Yahweh? Where do they go when they die? And who gets what parts of their shared mind? Are the parts they share copied and pasted to their respective souls in heaven and hell? Now imagine two grown men, Hank and Harry, have the same condition. Harry commandeers Hank's phone and surfs the internet for Twinkies, but stumbles across the wrong website. He stares through his brother's eyes at the salty display of floppy noodly fun time and enjoys it. Which one of the twins now needs redemption for their sinful lusty ways? Take a similar example. Prince and Love Zalte were conjoined twins joined at the stomach. Unbeknownst to most, your enteric nervous system of your digestive tract is actually referred to as your second brain.
90% or more of the body's serotonin actually lies in the gut, not in your head. And about half of the body's dopamine lies in the gut. And this is actually now the subject of studies trying to link what's happening in the gut with what's happening in our head.
Now, it's not conscious, but this brain in your gut communicates with, but also independent from your brain. It's affected by diet and can influence your mood and mental health. If Prince gorges on carb-heavy food, making his twin feel lethargic, is his brother's soul guilty of being a lazy, slothful sluggard?
Okay, so Eric, there we have the story of conjoined twins, where in one case, the individual, one of the two is seeing what is information that's coming in through the other twin's eyes. In another case, we realize that the stomach has been referred to as the second brain. Dopamine, serotonin, some of the stuff that controls mood and happiness and pleasure is related to the stomach. So if you share a stomach, and one of the twins decides to gorge on food, does that mean the other one is guilty of slothfulness or something? I mean, these are questions I want you to answer. But before you do, let me just say, Daniel James Hull wanted to say, can you thank Eric for how helpful he has been for me in helping me understand the soul and arguments for and against? So you've got fans out there, Eric, or at least people that have benefited from your ministry. So yeah, what do you have to say about this idea that, I mean, does this ruin it for us? Should I give up my belief in the soul?
Well, first, let me say I appreciate the person who commented that really does mean a lot, especially if you know my story of how I got into apologetics and dealing with the soul. And you can find that testimony, if you will, on my YouTube channel. So, excuse me, coffee, not the virus. I just swallowed wrong. Yeah. So actually, these again. Pointing back to our friend Cameron, where he points out that questions are not arguments. So there's a lot to be said here. But before answering, one thing I do want to point out is in that clip, before I get to the answers, it's funny how it talks about the chemicals that are in the stomach, and it's almost like referred to as a second brain. But he also says, but the stomach is not conscious. My question is, if everything's reducible to something physical, then why would you say the stomach is not conscious? Why? It seems special pleading to say, well, we know the brain's conscious because it has these chemicals and these interactions, but we're not going to say the gut or stomach is conscious, even though we know that it has a lot of the chemicals that were usually associated with the brain. Well, how do you know which one is and isn't conscious? Well, it's because it's based on a lot of assumptions that you're using, and I think on a physicalist position, you can't necessarily rule out the fact that the gut or stomach might in fact be conscious. And that goes into even what's called the P zombies thought experiment. And people who know philosophy of mind would be familiar with that thought experiment without explaining it. But I just thought that was first just interesting for him to make that distinction without really an explanation.
Well, yeah. And before you go on, Eric, I should say, one thing that we need to note is it's you might think, well, wait a minute, of course, the consciousness aspect would be more related to the brain, because the brain, we're our brain. Theoretically, we've seen enough sci-fi movies. If we could handle the rest of our bodily functions but keep our brain in a jar or something and keep it going, we would still be alive. Our consciousness has to be in our brain. But what might surprise you, and Eric, you can speak more to this if you want to, but what might surprise you is actually we haven't been able to exactly locate where consciousness arises from and what exactly it is. This is why we run into problems where people, this is one of the biggest questions in science, in brain science and philosophy of mind right now. Just earlier this year, Unbelievable Radio Justin Bridley had a guy on, an atheist guy, to talk about, I don't know if it was the soul or something, but he was saying, yeah, I'm an atheist, but we have to admit, this is a real problem. We don't know exactly what to make out of this. And so he punted toward what I think Sam Harris's wife has written a book about, which is this panpsychism sort of an idea. But the bottom line is, this is still a big problem. So I think your point, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, I want to make sure I'm understanding you, is, look, we know that the stomach has something to do with stuff that we would typically think of as consciousness-related stuff or brain stuff. And of course, the brain has to do with stuff that we would think of that way. So if you're going to say, no, it has to be in the brain, consciousness has to be in the brain, it can't be in the gut, how come? It looks like you're just playing willy-nilly with this. Is that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, Thomas Nagel was one of the first to, I guess, make it more popular with his book, Mind and Cosmos, that position you're talking about, panpsychism, where he himself kind of brought that to the forefront, saying there are immaterial mental states and properties that we cannot reduce to something physical, and we have to do something with them. So it boils basically down to, where do they come from? And obviously, I won't be able to go into a lot of details over a lot of these arguments, but basically, the problem is that when you look at the metaphysics and you look at the physical structures, we know that you can't just get consciousness squirting into existence by rearranging physical matter. If you get matter and rearrange it like Legos, you don't get something what's called sui generis to pop into existence, something that hasn't been there before, something totally, completely new. In other words, I don't get a bunch of red Legos, rearrange the structure, add a few, take away a few, and all of a sudden the red Legos become blue, because the color blue is not something that is based on the structure rearrangement or parts of Legos. This is something different than something like a structural property. So when we see that there's no way that you get neurons, rearranging them, you get consciousness, basically you're going to have to say, okay, if consciousness exists, we know that it can't come from just rearranging neurons or atoms or particles. So we're going to have to essentially bite the bullet and say this is fundamental to reality. And if it's fundamental to reality, then it must be potentially the case that consciousness could exist in any and everything. So any and everything potentially has the ability to become conscious, and that's where you get the panpsychist position, namely the position that anything could be, and I'm oversimplifying here, but basically you could take anything, give it the right physical conditions, and it will become conscious.
Yeah, so my understanding of panpsychism, and you kind of gave a good one there, but since we're having trouble, so what you laid out first was this whole idea that we're familiar with, where physical matter doesn't think. It's not conscious. Like, we can imagine building the most complex android robot AI right now, and we may be wrong, but I don't think we are, to intuitively kind of recognize, yeah, but it's still not conscious. It's following programming and all those kind of things. So if you're a materialist who believes that matter is all there is, you're kind of left with this tough situation of saying, okay, well then how is it that we do go from physical stuff that isn't about anything, that doesn't have these conscious properties? How do we go from that to something that does? And so this panpsychism is one way that some atheists and others would say that, well, maybe it's the case that everything has an element of consciousness to it, so that it might be hard for you to imagine that an electron, for example, is conscious, and we wouldn't say that it's conscious in that it's thinking about what it's like to be an electron, but that it has an element of consciousness to it. And the more complex the arrangement of things, the more complex the consciousness becomes, until you get to something like human beings. Now, let's table that for a minute. We'll come back to it. By the way, before we get too far away from the brain-gut thing, Mike Winger says that brain and the gut thing is interesting because some have ridiculed the Bible for mentioning the gut in relation to emotions. And it could be that the Bible is, it could be that there's something to what the Bible is doing there with that, or what the authors are doing. It's important to recognize that different cultures place the seat of emotions, so to speak, in different organs based on their cultural setting. We typically think of the heart, and of course the Bible talks about the heart as well. So let's go ahead and well, first of all, I got a super chat here from Jim Amberg. Jim Amberg is basically the man who single-handedly makes sure that these live streams keep happening, because if nobody else gives a super chat, Jim does. And I don't expect or require anyone to give super chats, but Jim, thank you so much. He says, I can't watch this, but I'll watch it tomorrow and it's going to be great. Thank you so much, Jim. Appreciate that so much. So let's go on right now to did you say everything you wanted to say about that first clip?
Yeah, no, because we haven't really even touched much of the first clip, but you can see how quickly these things kind of just relate to everything. But what Mike brought up was a really interesting point. I didn't want to bring it up because it would have led to other stuff, but since he brought it up, and he's our friend, we can touch on that. Yeah, he's absolutely right. And I've heard Moreland talk about this. Because if you notice, the chemicals that were said to be in the gut are chemicals that have to do with things like feelings of happiness. What's really interesting, and it's almost as if God knew what he was talking about all along. Fasting can and should and is used as a spiritual discipline, but also used as a way of just disciplining oneself overall in spiritual formation. Because when you fast, you're essentially telling your body, you need to listen to what I say. You don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do. And even if you're hungry, and even if by being hungry, you're going to deprive me of these feelings of happiness and feeling good, it doesn't matter, because I'm teaching you, my flesh, to not react and act merely and solely on my emotions, because I'm going to do what I should do, even if I don't feel like doing that. So even in fasting, yeah, it's absolutely a way of, as Paul puts it, submitting the flesh. So that's a really interesting point Mike brings up, and he's absolutely correct.
Yeah. So when it comes to this issue of the kid with the brain, the two conjoined twins that are sharing this certain features of the physical body, and then we talk about the person who gorges themselves, and then the conjoined twin who shares that stomach. What's the spiritual requirement there? It almost sounds comical, and I don't. HolyKoolaid has spoken with me a little bit in chat before, and so I appreciate that he's been a very friendly, interlocutor on these things. But I think he probably knows and probably intended a little bit of comical snark maybe in that, because of course, if we have a God who is a just judge, and one individual, if we're talking souls here, one individual who happens to share aspects of a physical existence with another individual, it doesn't mean that the person who didn't gorge themselves is somehow culpable for the sin of the individual who did gorge themselves or who took drugs or whatever else you want to say. God is not legalistic in that sense. God is aware of what's happening more than we are. And so we can trust that God is going to do well by us and judge rightly. And his judgment does not rely on our confusion about the nature of a physical body. So anything more on that clip, Eric?
Well, to first touch on that clip is when it talks about so you have these twin who's able to see through the eyes of the other twin and whatnot. So understand that when these kind of questions are raised as objections, it's basically an attempt to say that if you cannot answer this or give a possible model which can explain this on your position, then your position is insufficient because it can't explain what we do know or explain these phenomena or facts. Well, but these are relatively easy to explain. Even if we can't say for certain this is the explanation, we can at least give the possibilities that would make sense in our view. So, for example, sure, if I am somehow conjoined physically with something or someone else, then it doesn't make it hard to conceive of the notion that I could utilize things that are connected to parts of my brain that I can control or have power over. But I mean, that's no different than saying, like, let's say, for example, if you grab my arm and you started making me punch myself and you say, stop hitting yourself, that's easy to conceive of, but that's because there's a separation. But if we were somehow connected and somehow able to move your brain firings were able to move the muscles within my arm, well, that might take a little bit more explaining, but in principle, you still have the same thing happening. Namely, you are using something that would naturally be considered mine to do something that you want to do. But what I would like to see in those scenarios, does the other person, like let's say if you were looking at these conjoined twins, does it have to first be the case that one twin gives up movement over these limbs in order for the other twin to be able to use it? I'd be interested in seeing other hypothetical scenarios or seeing how this plays out overall. But also what you mentioned about, is God gonna, which one is God gonna judge for doing for overeating, basically? Well, when you see these kind of questions asked, it shows really quickly how little a person has thought through philosophical issues and things of like ethics and metaphysics, because we know that actions in and of themselves aren't necessarily right or wrong, but intents behind the actions are what God looks at. The Bible talks about men look at the outward, but God looks at the heart. So obviously it would be whoever intended to do that, regardless of what mouth or hand they use to accomplish this sinful act. Obviously, God's going to judge the heart of the person behind the action, not just the action itself or whose hand was being used to engage in that act.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So that's a good way of looking at it, is the intention that we're looking at. So these individuals that do horrible things like have their children, little small children, smoke pot or something, or if I injected you, Eric, with some drug in the middle of the night because we're sharing a hotel room and I wanted to play a horrible and devious trick on you and injected you with some drug, obviously people would blame me for that. They wouldn't blame you for the fact, yeah, you're now high just like you would be if you did it yourself, but you didn't seek that out. You weren't trying to make that happen. And in that sense, we could talk about other things. To keep this a rated PG stream, we'll say forced copulation. When that happens, nobody blames the person who had a sexual act forced upon them. You blame the person who forced the act. And so right. I think those are good examples of where if you take it out of this somewhat very unusual situation of a conjoined twin and look at it with things we already know that are like that, it just doesn't fly.
Yeah, and I don't know if he's gotten to the clip yet about the splitting.
No, we're not there. We're not there yet. We'll get to that. So do you want to go ahead to another clip?
It's up to you.
All right, let's take a look now at what happens when. So how do we make sense of, Eric? Doesn't this disprove the soul, Eric? If we have a problem where we have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, we all do, and there are these weird situations where you'll have. At least this is what they're saying, that you almost have two personalities. You have one personality that's claiming certain thoughts and beliefs, and the other personality that's claiming different thoughts and beliefs existing in the same body. So we're going to look at that clip now and see what it has to say about what if you have a brain where one hemisphere is a theist and the other hemisphere is an atheist. So here's the clip.
Procedure? What happens when one hemisphere is a theist and the other an atheist? That's not a hypothetical. It actually happened.
Now comes the big question. What if you ask, do you believe in God? So I said, do you believe in God? And the right hemisphere went straight to yes. I asked the same question to the left hemisphere, yes, no, I don't know. It went to no. So here's a human being whose right hemisphere is an atheist, and left hemisphere, on the other hand, believes in God. And this finding should have sent a tsunami through the theological community, but barely produced a ripple, because it raises all kinds of profound theological questions.
Now, a completely separate phenomenon from split brain patients is dissociative identity disorder, formerly multiple personality disorder, in which one person embodies multiple identities with different beliefs, hopes, desires, and personalities. How many souls does that person have? And can the religious efforts of one identity save all of them, even if the others all follow different religions?
Okay, so we have situations here, Eric, where one half of the brain is a theist, the other half is an atheist, or what if you have multiple personality disorder and you have multiple religious beliefs then among the different personalities? Therefore, Eric, no soul for you. The soul doesn't exist. What say you, sir?
I say what a dumb argument. But no, in all sincerity, well, I mean, I was sincere there, but a lot of things to be said here. First and foremost, I go back to kind of what I was alluding to in the beginning, is the reasons for which someone believes something are separate from, but how do you explain this tough situation? So whenever I argue for the existence of the soul, and again, you know, I go through that on my channel, you'll find things like that consciousness is not physical, and how we know that. I am indivisible, but my body and brain are not. I maintain identity through change, but my body and brain does not. So meaning that all these arguments for the soul are not dependent on whether or not I can explain this unusual alleged phenomenon that's happening. So when, in other words, no one comes to believe in the existence of the soul by looking at a split brain patient phenomenon saying, I can explain this, therefore I'm going to believe in the soul. Second, which usually, again, when the person brings this up, it depends on who's bringing it up. Depending on who brings it up is going to depend on what point they're trying to make. Sometimes they bring it up as a, well, how do you answer this? If you can't answer it, no soul. Or they bring it up as, look, there's two streams of consciousness, so does that mean you have two souls? And they're attempting to reductio ad absurdum. But notice that whatever explanation you give, none of that would necessarily disprove a soul. Let's pretend the typical thing is, well, there's two streams of consciousnesses, or it's creating another person. At worst, that would only prove that, okay, so now you have two souls in one body. Doesn't prove I don't have a soul, and has nothing to do with the arguments that I give for the soul. But you know, and you can come up with a lot more examples of how you can explain this by conceding their point, and yet it still wouldn't disprove a soul. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and, for the sake of time, jump to, so how would I explain this in a substance dualist view of the soul? Well, there's a lot of interesting things to note with these kind of experiments. First and foremost, you find that what often happens is when you have that middle part of the brain split, it doesn't allow these two hemispheres to communicate. And whenever you look up videos on these things, what you mainly see are people doing experiments where they have, like, they're looking at a screen, and basically one eye, the right eye, sees something on the left side, and the left eye sees something on the right side, or vice versa. And basically they're saying, you know, can you tell me what you see? And the person can't, because whatever part of the brain is associated with those type of motor functioning is not associated with the part of the brain that's recognizing the object. So they need the other hand to write down what the person's seeing. Now, again, first and foremost, these kind of things only happen in these unique type of experiments. Meaning, whenever they're done with the test and the doctor shakes a person's hand or writes them a check, whatever, for doing the test, when they get in their car, buckle up, and go home, they don't have these issues. So it's not as if these people are daily waking up thinking, "Oh my goodness, I have no idea what to do, and my life is ruined because I can't even walk 2 steps without, tripping over something that I can't see." Think of it like this: if you're looking straight and you cover one eye, then obviously there's going to be something that you're not going to be able to see on this side. And if you do the same with the other eye, same problem. But if you take your hands off your eyes, you can see everything clearly. Something similar is happening when you cut that middle part of the brain that connects the hemispheres. Now, what about the issue you brought up, which I have not seen done in tests? The only time I've heard this brought up is when this guy, I think it's Fuzz Rana, who you played a clip of, and I've seen that clip many times. He talks about the test. I've never seen the test done, but let's just give him the benefit of the doubt and say, yeah, this does happen, or these type of things do happen. Because what he also says in a longer version of that talk is that you also find that, people with one hand will grab a cigarette and with the other hand, they'll slap the cigarette out of their hand. What's going on here? That's slightly different than the split brain case that's called, I think it's alien hand syndrome, which may be related to this, but it's also an entirely different type of phenomenon. Not necessarily related to this, but people often group these two things together. What's mainly associated with these is what I talked about, where you put someone in front of a screen, don't let them move their head and tell them what they see, and there's usually different perceptions. But let's go ahead and say that, in fact, one part of the brain is an atheist, so to speak. One part of the brain is a theist. Again, this wouldn't prove that consciousness is physical, wouldn't prove there's no soul. But how would I explain something like this? Well, it's pretty simple. Whenever you I'll simplify it this way. Suppose the right side of my brain, the right hemisphere of my brain, is associated with my doubts. If God exists, then how do I explain X, Y, and Z? And the left side of my brain deals with the analytical, abstract thinking of how I came to conclusions to satisfy answers that alleviate my doubts. Well, if you cut that middle part of the brain that doesn't allow these two hemispheres to communicate, in other words, if you don't give my soul access to one side of the brain, and I can only access one side of the brain at a time or be consciously aware of one side of the brain at a time, then obviously, if all I have is my doubts, I might identify as an atheist. If you don't give me access to the answers that I've already discovered, it would be no different than you having me study for a test and then hitting me over the head really, really hard to where I lose my memory. Does it mean that I am now two different people? No, of course not. It just means that something has happened that has limited or taken away my access to the information I have gained. And on the substance dualist view, the soul uses the brain and body like an instrument. And as I've often said when I argue for the soul, suppose I'm using a guitar. If you mess with my guitar, you mess with my ability to play the music. So it doesn't mean that the soul is reducible to the brain and body. It doesn't mean there is no soul. If anything, you can explain this by saying you've messed up my instrument. You've inhibited the way I'm able to interact with the information I've gained by messing with the guitar that I used to think.
Wow, that's pretty good. I mean, that sounds like, it's one of those deals where when you first hear a clip like that, as you said, just assuming that everybody's telling the truth and these experiments were right, you think, man, that really seems like, I don't know what we can say to that. But that makes so much sense when you point it out. If you cut off my access, one half of my brain, you cut off its access to the answers to these doubts, then yeah, all I'm going to have is the doubts. Really, really interesting.
And I shared that with Moreland before over the phone, and he said that was a really, really good answer. So I just want to shamelessly throw that out there.
In case you guys don't know, J.P. Moreland is really well known for popularizing some of the good stuff about the soul that's out there, and has a couple of books on the subject that you should check out. So yeah, that's a good feather in your cap to say that you taught Moreland a thing or two there.
I wouldn't go that far. That's almost borderline blasphemy, but I'll say he liked my response to that case.
Yeah. So, all right, you ready for the next clip, or is there more to say there? All right, let's go on to this one. Has to do with, well, where do these souls come from? Are there all these spirit babies in heaven? like some kind of Mormon Disney cartoon or something. And whenever physical bodies are born or reach to a certain place or are conceived or whatever, then God says, "Oh, grab another spirit baby and throw it in that body." Or is there something happening during development that is soulish, we might say? By the way, before we go to this next clip and talk about that, someone brought up a moment ago, I don't know if I'll be able to find it real quickly, but someone brought up the point about, as Christians, how do we make sense of the spirit soul? Is that the same thing, that whole thing? You know, I know I used to, when I used to preach, when I was pastoring, I would talk about the fact that we had there are people that believe in that we are trichotomous, in the sense that we are a physical body and then a soul and then a spirit. And the way they would frame it up is the spirit is the part of you that gets redeemed or whatever. The soul is the personality and that sort of thing. I know William Lane Craig says the spirit and the soul can be used either interchangeably, or the spirit is an aspect of the soul. And so it's an interesting thing. And if so, do animals have souls and not spirits? Do animals have souls and spirits? Do all dogs go to heaven and all cats go to hell? Probably, but you answer.
Yeah. You want me to jump on that now? Or are you
go ahead and answer that before we go on to the next clip.
Yeah. So quite a bit unpacked there. So the position I hold to is called substance dualism. And again, I'm having to simplify a lot of this stuff just for the sake of time. So you're basically pointing out the fact that there are two types of substances at play here when we're dealing with what a human being is. First and foremost, I am a soul. What is a soul? A soul is an immaterial substance that contains consciousness, animates the body, and as we're about to get into, also gives rise and existence to the body. But I'll say that after you play the clip, which means I am an immaterial substance, and my body could be seen as a type of physical substance. So you have a physical substance and an immaterial substance. What am I? I'm not my body. I'm an immaterial substance that has a body. So technically speaking, I don't have a soul. I am a soul. I have a body, but I am a soul, and I am a soul that has a body. And here's where I like to point out that actually I've recently changed my position on this, because I actually do have a soul. It's a Kia Soul, and it's orange, and it's about 30 feet from me in my parking lot. And I bought that car just so I could make that joke. And I had JP Moreland in my soul a few months ago, and when I said, "Do you know what kind of car you're in?" and I told him why I bought the car, he said, "You're the man." So that's all the validation I need, worth every penny.
I have personally taken up residence in your soul as well.
This is true. Yes, this is true. And I love the fact that I could just keep making jokes as long as I keep this car. So I am a soul. That's that. So when you use the word I is an indexical word. It refers to something. So when I say over here is a word relative to something. It's relative to a point. And when I say there, same thing. When I say the word I, it's an indexical word that's talking about a subject, a self, an agent. When I say I, here's the question we can ask. When I say the word I, am I referring to an immaterial substance as me being the self, or am I referring to my brain and body? There's lots of arguments I can go into to show that I'm referring to an immaterial soul, but again, for the sake of time, go on my YouTube channel, you can see the arguments there. But if I'm referring to me, the soul, then when I say the word I, I'm referring to the self, the soul, not my brain and body, which means whatever else happens is going to be because me, the self, the soul, is moving it. So think of a captain of a ship. You have one captain of an entire ship, and this captain orders what the other people are going to do. He orders, how, let's say it's a wooden ship, he's going to steer it. He's going to tell the people on deck, how to turn the sails, what to do, how to pull the ropes, how to do all this. So he's basically conducting everything going on in the ship. Now, while there are different parts of the ship, it doesn't mean there's different ships. It means there's one ship and one captain of the ship. So think of the soul as a captain of the ship. Now, what about the spirit? The reason I am no longer a trichotomist, which is what you pointed out, I used to be, is because when you talk about philosophy of mind, you're talking about how many substances are at play here. If you have a soul as a substance and the body as a substance, which one am I? I'm the soul. So what's the body? It's something my soul uses. A trichotomist would essentially have to say there is a third substance, namely a spirit. So then we can ask the same question: which one am I? Am I the soul? Am I the spirit? Or am I the body? Well, I think Scripture is clear that we communicate God via our spirit. Okay, so let's say your spirit communicates with God. Okay, so when the spirit communicates with God, am I communicating with God? If you say yes, then you have to say then, okay, the answer to the question, which one am I, soul, body, or spirit, which one of these substances, you're going to have to say, well, I am the spirit. Okay, well, then that means you're not the soul. So when your soul does something, you can't say it's you doing it. It's some other substance and entity that's doing it. But if you say, no, I did it, okay, well, then you have to ask the question again, which one are you? So the easiest way, I guess you can put it, is saying something like this. I ask people, when they bring up this question, I ask them this. Because they usually say, how many parts do you have? And they say, you have 3 parts, because you have a soul, a spirit, and a body. And I ask them, well, how many bodies do you have? And they say 1. I say, okay. How many hands do you have? They say 2. I say, oh, so you have 3 bodies. They say, no, I have 1 body, and those 2 hands are part of that 1 body. I said, okay, in the same principle, I am a soul, the self, and within my soul grounds my capacities for other things, such as communication with God. So my spirit, we can explain it as the spirit is the mechanism, the capacity through which I communicate with God. Let's go back to the analogy of using the body. What part of my body tastes? Not my eyes, not my fingertips, not my ears. My tongue does. So my tongue is the avenue through which I can experience the sensation of tasting. In the same way, my spirit is that capacity of my soul by which I'm able to communicate with God. Now, you also raise another question. Do animals have spirits? That's a good question. Do they have souls? Yes. Why? Because they're conscious, and consciousness is not physical. Again, I'm going to waive the arguments, but if consciousness is not physical, and if consciousness is possessed by a thinking subject, then that thinking subject must also be an immaterial substance in order to possess the conscious states and properties. So if animals think, then they're conscious. Do they have spirits? I don't know, because I haven't seen my dog praying, before eating dinner or whatnot, or maybe she's just a heathen. I don't know. But in essence, I am a soul, and within my soul there are different capacities. One of those capacities is spirit, and it is my spirit by which I communicate with God. So you have 2 substances, and the spirit can just be seen as a part of the capacity of the soul.
Yeah. So, and that I think sounds similar to what William Lane Craig has said in the past. And one way we could, because me and my father used to argue about this a lot, because I would say, hey, I'm a substance dualist. And he'd say, no, you need to be a trichotomist. And I think a way to look at this that is a little more stable and accommodates both positions is what you just said. We are substance dualists. It's not another substance. We have a physical and an immaterial substance, but in the immaterial aspect of our substance, there are different properties or attributes or whatever. So that's pretty good. All right, let's go on to the next one, which is where do these souls come from after all?
Can I touch one more thing on that?
Yeah.
So, and another thing, because one thing you just mentioned, I just remembered was, that even Craig mentions that sometimes these are used interchangeably. A really good book I'd recommend, Body and Soul by J.P. Moreland and Scott B. Ray. It goes into a lot of great stuff, and I love this thing. And that answers a lot of other questions. But yes, the Bible can use these things interchangeably, and there's a chapter on the biblical text and basis for substance dualism. But an important thing to keep in mind is that the Bible also uses certain devices like we would today to focus on a particular part of something, but we're still referring to the whole of it. So, for example, if I said all hands on deck, I'm not saying I want you to chop off your arms and throw them on the deck. I'm saying I want your entire body there. But when I say all hands on deck, that is a figure of speech I'm using to allude you to the fact that I'm asking you to come here so that you can be put to work. So although I'm referring to the hands, it doesn't necessarily mean I want only the hands. I'm using a part to whole figure of speech. Same thing can be used when it says like his face fell, right? We don't really think the guy's face fell, or his heart was this or that. So sometimes, yes, the Bible uses soul and spirit interchangeably, but it's usually because it's trying to make a particular theological point by focusing on one aspect of a person while still referring to the person as a whole.
Yeah, and someone had mentioned something in the chat about Old Testament references to soul, and we're well aware that in the Old Testament, and there is debate about this too, but soul in a sense at moments can be interchangeable with just life, life in general.
Sure.
Nefesh can be just life. But when specifically this person asked, we'll throw it up here on the screen. Jaden says, how about that verse in Genesis that says her soul was departing for she was dying? Is her consciousness what is departing, or her as a person departing from the physical world? And I think the answer would be yes. The answer is the life was going out of her body, and one of the most obvious ways of knowing that, or manifestations of that, is there's no more consciousness happening. And so I think without, we want to stay away from sometimes what is known as concordism. That's where we look back at an ancient text, even the Bible, and we try to apply modern scientific understandings on what was written, because after all, did the God who inspired Scripture know all of the scientific facts and more than what we know today? Of course he did, and he does, but he was communicating to people in the way that they would understand, and using means that they would recognize. So when people say, well, wait a minute, why doesn't the cosmology always look exactly like cosmological models today when we see it in the Bible? Or why doesn't the Scripture go into all this stuff about, hey, one day you're going to hear about a multiverse, and just once you know that's bunk, or once you know that's true, why doesn't it talk that way? Because the person listening would have to say, with the soul, or with all those kind of other things, the different aspects of anthropology or the universe, the person would have to say, wait a minute, why are you telling me this stuff? Don't you know that I live in 2000 BC and I have no idea what you're talking about and have no way of relating to the things you're describing? So rather than God giving them all PhDs in, some science so that he can explain the theological truth, he just explains the theological truth. So a lot is wrapped up in a statement like her soul was departing for she was dying. Her consciousness was going away and the life was leaving her body. So, all right, let's finally now jump to this question. Where does how do we get these souls? What are they? Where do they come from?
Finally, how do souls form? If ensoulment in the human body occurs at conception, what happens to that soul when the zygote splits and develops into two embryos? Is the soul divided and each twin gets half, or multiplied into two? And what about when one zygote cannibalizes its twin in utero? This can and does occur in some intersex cases and can result in one person having the genitals of both sexes. In the animal kingdom, this is called a chimera. Do these people possess two souls in one body, or one super soul?
All right, Eric. So first of all, I want to say one of our Trinity students, MJ Jackson, is here and has given us a super chat. And thanks, by the way, folks. Again, this is the first time I've ever used this software, and I'm well aware that I've got yellow text on top of a yellow logo, and it's hard to read. I'm going to work on all these things so that next time this won't happen. But MJ Jackson, thank you so much for the super chat. You mean the world to me. I was saying a while ago, Jim Amberg keeps ensuring that these live streams keep going, and you do too. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate that. All right, so Eric, this was the clip that has to do with what do you do with these situations where you have these sperm and egg situation, and I think you're familiar with all that. So lay out, give us a good response. Doesn't this mean that you've knocked down you've responded well to these other issues, but I don't think you can get over this one. I think now we know that the soul is bunk, and we at least need to become Christian physicalists, which is also something we could touch on in a bit. But go ahead and give it your best shot.
Yeah, so this goes into the where the soul comes from, the origination of the soul. And there's basically two views. And before I go into the two views, again, these objections do not disprove the existence of the soul. If anything, they give us a hard question to answer, a challenge, but it's not a defeater. It's not an undercutting defeater. It's not just a regular defeater. It's just a hard question. These don't, in other words, let's pretend I took his worst case scenario. Oh, so, is it a super soul? Let's say yes. Physicalism is still false. If you need God for a soul, atheism is false. In other words, his pathetic attempts at reductio ad absurdums are not reductios that disprove our position. If anything, it would have us modify our position, but he would still be wrong on his position that there is no soul. Okay, but let's go ahead and jump into it. So you have two views of the origin of the soul. You have the creationist view of the soul, not to be confused with a young earth creation or old earth creationist vocabulary. A creationist view of the soul and a traducian view of the soul. So the creationist view of the soul, and just to simplify it for the sake of time, is basically is that every time the right physical conditions are in place, such as a sperm and egg coming together, then God looks at it and says, "Yep, those conditions look good enough for me. Let me zap that bad boy with a soul." And God puts a soul, it creates a soul and puts it into the physical conditions that are met and sufficient for a human being to exist. So God is constantly creating souls on the creationist view of the soul. On the seducing view of the soul, it's a little bit different and a bit more technical and metaphysical. I mean, the other one's technical too, but for the sake of simplicity, the traducing view of the soul is a bit more complicated in that basically God has instituted a world, and he was free to institute whatever physical conditions and metaphysical conditions to an extent that he wanted to, but he has made a world in which that when a mom and a dad come together and they love each other, they're able to reproduce. Now, on the traducian view, your body is infused with soul. It's kind of like pouring sugar in water and stirring it. It's now mixed together. So biological tissue is infused with what is called totipotentiality, that this biological tissue has the potential to bring about a substantial change for a soul to come into existence. Now, here's where it gets a little bit technical. So basically, well, let me finish that. So basically, on the traducian view, you exist in part because of your parents. Like you, literally you, the person that you are, which means it would be metaphysically impossible for you to exist with a different set of parents or a different time and place. Now, I can't help but go here. As a Molinist, this to me screams Molinism, especially when you consider that if God wanted you to exist, then certain things had to come. You had to have a certain lineage of people and parents and grandparents before you in order for you to exist. Now, what's interesting here is a lot of times when you study philosophy, your Christian lingo is often taken away, and sometimes I think it's funny. So, for example, I hear people saying, and I'm not trying to point fingers or dog on anybody, but people saying, well, if God would have wanted you to exist at another point in time, he could have put you there, but he put you there for, and here comes the Christian lingo, for such a time as this. Well, if the traducian view of the soul is true, then no, God could not have created you at another point in time because you exist in part because of your parents, and he couldn't have created you under a different set of parents because the soul that you have is in part due to the parents that you have. So God, if he wanted you to exist, could have only created you in this point in time. It's not like he could have created you for another time. So such a time as this, I kind of giggle a little bit to myself when I read those things. But nevertheless, I get the sentiment. Now, I was talking to a Calvinist once, and forgive the tangent here. I'm not going to mention the guy's name, but if I mention his name, everybody in the chat listening would know who this guy is. He's a well-known apologist, but he's a Calvinist, and I was talking to him, and I know that he holds to the traducian view of the soul. And I said, but he also rejects Molinism. And I said, well, I think if you hold to your traducian view, you're going to have to, as a Calvinist, I think you're going to have to take Molinism and accept it. He says, well, what do you mean? Well, if on Calvinism, God elects who is saved, by default, he would also have to elect who exists. And if God elects who exists and who is saved, then he would also have to elect a previous lineage of parents that you have to have necessarily had in order for you to exist, in order for you to be saved so that he can elect you. If that's the case, and the traducian view is true, and if Calvinism is true, then I think you need Molinism in order for God to know the possible counterfactuals that would have to be in place in order for your parents to meet, for you to exist, for you to be saved, so that he can elect you so that you would be saved. So if you're a Calvinist and you hold to a traducian view, you're going to have to take Molinism hook, line, and sinker, basically.
Well, hold on a second, Eric, because there's been some interesting comments in the chat that we probably should get to. So, one, and we are going to, at the end, I'll try to go back through some of these and look and see what we have for, other comments that I missed. I know you guys are asking a lot of questions, and I'm trying to keep up as best I can with the new software. And not all of them are questions. Some of them are simply statements. What do you say to something like this? This has been bouncing around in the chat. Not My Real Name says, just say the soul is an unprovable metaphysical idea. Now, I think this person is a non-religious person, but they're saying, just say the soul is an unprovable metaphor. In other words, hey, just kind of admit it. You can't prove it. It's just the way it is. Can we prove it?
Yes, can we prove it? Yes, we can. So to the statement, just say it's an unprovable idea, my response is no.
Yeah, and you have arguments from the soul and for the soul on your own YouTube channel, but there are a number. I don't know if this would count as an argument for the soul, but one of the things that is most compelling to me is the continuity of identity issue that comes up sometimes, and you alluded to indirectly earlier. Philosophers of mind have discussed this for a long time. What is it that we call you that continues over a period of time? Is it just the physical matter that makes up you? Well, it doesn't seem to be that, because that cycles out every so many years, and you have basically a new physical body with new physical matter, and you're not you anymore. Okay, well, that's not what it is. Maybe it's memory. Maybe we can ground it in memory. But then that runs into problems too, because even if your memories can continue to exist into your new physical bodies as cells cycle out and those sorts of things, the earliest memory I have is probably from when I was 3 or 4 years old. Was I not me before I was 3 or 4 years old and can't remember? If it's only my memories, then am I a different person if I get amnesia and can't and don't remember anything about my life prior? I mean, we would say colloquially, you're a different person now, but no one wants to actually say you are literally a different consciousness. You're a different person.
Right.
So it seems like we need something to explain the continuity of identity. The soul would do that really well, I think. But
right.
You can comment on that if you want, Eric, but for more on that, Eric's got a lot on his channel.
I mean, yeah, so basically you're a person, and a personhood is grounded. Your identity as a human being is grounded in something, and not just a human being, but you yourself. In other words, even if you and I were the same clothes and have the same characteristics, we're two different people. So my identity must be grounded in something. It's either grounded in an immaterial substance or grounded in the brain and body. We know the brain and body constantly change. I'll allude you to what's called the Ship of Theseus thought experiment. Go on my YouTube channel, look at my debate with Tom Jump, or you can look at like the 7-minute highlight video where I talk about that specific argument, where in a nutshell, if I have a tricycle and I take a wheel off, it's a bicycle. Why? Because purely physical objects, their existence and identity is necessarily dependent on the parts and structure that they possess. You change the parts or remove the parts or change the structure, you change its existence and identity. So when I remove a wheel, a tricycle ceases to exist, a bicycle comes to be. If I'm just a purely physical object, the same would apply to me. However, if I remain the same throughout change and part replacement, then my identity cannot be grounded in something physical or something like my memory, and it therefore follows it must be grounded in something that transcends the physical, namely the soul. And the very idea and notion of change presupposes continuity and something underlining that change. When an apple goes from sweet to sour, it's not as if one apple stops existing and another one comes to exist. In order for change to even be possible, there has to be something that underlies that change and that keeps some type of a continuity throughout this change. If I do that throughout change or part replacement, then I must have a soul.
Yeah,
and I can't be just merely a brain and body.
And if anyone doesn't know about the Ship of Theseus, it's a philosophical hypothetical for understanding that what was just described, because they kept Theseus' ship. He was a great warrior and adventurer, and they kept his ship as a monument to his life. But over time, each part of the ship began to rot, and so they would replace it until ultimately you have a completely all new material. None of the material that made up the ship when Theseus had it was still there. It was completely new material. So then can you say this is in any sense Theseus' ship? In fact, if you're a Hunger Games fan out there, you should know who Theseus is. You can go read Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans and learn all about the adventures of Theseus that Hunger Games borrowed from. That's why there is a character in Hunger Games called Plutarch. But interesting stuff. But a simpler way of looking at it is I've got the axe that George Washington used to chop down the cherry tree. Now, the head of the axe has been changed 15 times, and the handle's been changed 4 times, but it's still the axe that George Washington used to chop down the cherry tree. In what sense? And believe it or not, there are actually physicalists, and there are even Christian physicalists who will say that this is that ship still is the same ship that was Theseusship. And that axe still is the axe that chopped down the cherry tree. And to my mind, how is that the same? It seems obvious to me that and I think if I was an atheist materialist, I would just say, yeah, we don't really know what to do about that. Maybe you aren't the same person as you move through. That's the best I think they could do, but I don't think deep down many people could really maintain that belief. It doesn't have what we would call livability in worldview analysis.
And that's what they would have to maintain. That's what Matt Dillahunty maintained in the debate I had with him on the soul. That's what Tom Jump maintained. In fact, when Tom Jump, I had to press him a few times, and eventually he said, no, I'm not the same person from one moment to the next. And I said, okay, well then in the past 30 minutes we've been talking, how many Tom Jumps have I been talking to? He didn't want to answer the question. And I'll just say one more thing that I've seen in a meme, which relates to this subject. I saw someone say how to eat healthy every day, and it had a bowl full of salad, and it said step 1, get a bowl, add lettuce, and make a salad. Step 2, remove the salad and put pizza in there. Step 3, enjoy your salad. But of course, it's pizza because you replace the lettuce with the pizza. Is it still a salad? Obviously not.
Yeah. And back to your Tom Jump issue, I mean, with this continuity of identity thing, if an atheist materialist is going to say, yeah, I just am a different person than I was when I was 10 years old, and not in the kind of poetic, metaphorical way. I literally am in every way a different person than I used to be. If you really believe that, why aren't you advocating for people who've been in prison for more than 7 or 10 years to be let free without any charges because they aren't the same person? And if your response to that is to roll your eyes and say, yeah, but Braxton, come on, that's ridiculous. And that's why the idea that there is not continuity of identity via a soul is ridiculous. We all know that we keep those people locked up until their sentence has been served because they are the same person, even if it's been 30 years. Now, they may be a person who has experienced change, as everyone recognizes, but they're still the same person. They're still the same conscious experience. So I think that's really valuable. But back to this issue of from whence the soul comes. What else do you have to say to that? Because I kind of took you on a train ride around Worldview Town. So you get back to it.
No, sorry, no, I love it. So in Traducian view,
finally, how do souls
biological matter has the total potentiality to have a substantial change occur and a new substance come to be? And remember, the soul is defined as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. We don't have time to go into what's called the doctrine of a substance. What is a substance, philosophically speaking, in contrast with an aggregate? Again, go to my channel for that. You can find it there. But here's how Moreland puts it. Because when you look at a starfish, if you cut a starfish arm, that severed starfish arm could potentially, and they've seen it happen, change into a completely new starfish. Now, if we assume for the sake of argument that I have already given all the arguments for the soul and you're convinced a soul exists, at this point the question is not, does this disprove the soul? The question is, given the existence of the soul, how do we explain this? And again, we're saying that for the sake of time because these questions are not objections. In fact, they're not objections at all. They're just, quote, hard questions to answer if what we believe is true. If the Traducian view of the soul is true, it explains it just fine because, again, you have the biological matter infused with soulish total potentiality. Here's a good way to think about substantial change. When I spoke with Moreland over the phone, and I'll have to see what book he referred to, something about how the leopard lost its spots or something like that, a book that talks about this, substantial change in a metaphysical sense. Moreland would argue, and unless he's changed his position on this, I don't know. This is when I spoke to him a few years ago. When you get water, we know that in order to get water, you can get hydrogen and oxygen, right? The right components of water. Get hydrogen and oxygen and put them together, and water comes to be. Now, Moreland would argue that technically speaking, the hydrogen and oxygen no longer exist within this substance. They have ceased to exist, and instead there has emerged, or a new substance comes into existence, namely what we call water. And this is also why you have new properties emerging, is because with a new substance comes new capacities and potential. So water has a property of wetness because you have an entirely new substance coming into existence based on the substantial change that took place by merging these hydrogen and oxygen molecules. So technically speaking, although we do say water is H2O, what we're really saying is these are the parts it took in order to get water, but metaphysically speaking, there is no hydrogen and oxygen within the water. It has taken a substantial change and a new substance has come into existence. With that in mind, without going any deeper, because I'm sure there's more questions now to that, but if we keep that in mind with regards to the soul, then yes, when the sperm and egg comes together, a substantial change happens and a soul comes to be that was in part based on the sperm and egg with their soulish totipotentiality. So whenever you have something like an embryo splitting, yeah, there are two souls there, we could say, present. And then when they come back together, one soul ceases to exist. Now, to get a little bit more technical and metaphysical, to help you better understand this, it would be important to understand when it comes to substances, and I know I say we want to get into the details, but this is going to be relevant, understanding the nature of a substance in contrast with something like an aggregate, which is just a collection of parts put together. So think of like Legos. When it comes to substances, one key difference is that for substances exist ontologically prior to its parts, whereas for aggregates, the parts exist ontologically prior to the whole. And I'm sure that was very helpful, but let me unpack that. When I take something like a car, which is an aggregate, it's a collection of parts put together, held together in a certain structure. They're separable parts. When I take a tire from a car, it remains a tire, and it still exists as a tire. What does this tell us? It tells us that the existence and identity of a tire, this thing exists and has its identity as a tire, independent from its connection to the car and independent from the car as a whole. Now, by contrast, when, as I already alluded to with the tricycle example, when you take a wheel off a tricycle, it loses its existence and identity as a tricycle, and it now becomes a bicycle, which means for aggregates, the parts exist prior, ontologically speaking, to the whole. Now, for substances, it's reversed. The whole exists ontologically prior to the parts. How do we know? What do we mean by that? My existence and identity as a human being, as a person, is not dependent on the parts or the structure. How do we know this? Because if you cut off my arms and legs, I am still a human person, which means my arms and legs are not essential to my existence and identity as a person. If anything, my parts, their existence and identity, are necessarily dependent on my existence as a whole. For example, when you cut my arm off, Aristotle said it ceases to become a human hand. It loses its identity as a human hand. And this is evident by the fact that within a few days, this hand will decay and cease to exist, which means its existence and identity is necessarily dependent on its connection and relation to the whole. Why? Because wholes exist prior to the parts. When a baby puppy is born, its eyes and ears aren't fully developed, but it's still a dog. It's still a puppy. Why? Because its existence and identity as a whole, as a substance, is ontologically prior to its existence, identity, and rise of its parts. So on the Traducian view of the soul, ontologically speaking, not chronologically speaking, that's important to understand that, ontologically speaking, your self, the substance, the soul exists prior to its parts. So if there is another whole or sperm and egg coming together, and if they split and we see two different wholes, we know that metaphysically speaking, there has to be underlining that metaphysically an immaterial substance, namely the soul. I can keep going, but tell me if I went too fast on something or if I need to break something else down a little bit more.
No, and what's great is we see in the chat people sharing resources on things that you're saying. And so someone just recommended J.P. Moreland's book on consciousness and the existence of God. So so good stuff. So let's move into this last portion now, and then we're going to go to addressing some questions, because I know we've gone long already. It's already been over an hour, 8 minutes past an hour. So why not? So recently, physicist Sean Carroll made made a pretty bombastic statement, and I don't know if it was recently, but Sean Carroll made this statement that we understand kind of and this is me paraphrasing, we understand kind of the physiological deterministic system that leads to things happening. We have formulas that can describe events. And so the idea that, back to this interaction problem that has underlied everything we've been saying today, if you're saying that the soul in some way interfaces with the physical body or the brain, or the stomach for that matter, then what you're saying is that in some way the soul is going to have to interact with electrons. And we already have formulas for how electrons act and react and move and all these kind of things and function. So, in essence, what he says is you would have to be saying that all of our equations that we have relied on for a long time are just wrong. And that is unacceptable because they are so practically useful. And so he says, we are at a place now where I think we can say scientifically the soul does not exist on scientific grounds. And so this ratchets it up because, all right, Eric, you dealt with HolyKoolaid. And he's a reasonable guy, a smart guy. He's an atheist YouTuber. But now, but we're ratcheting it. You're taking Pritchett's place here today with the snarky comments. I mean, look, show him your shirt. Show your shirt on the screen.
Yeah,
that's Pritchett. And by the way, you can get that shirt. It says, "That's enough pseudo-pious sanctimonious blather." And you can get that shirt, by the way, if you go to TrinityRadio.org and go to the resources page. It's right there. You can get the merch. But and if you do, by the way, take pictures of yourself with the Trinity Radio merch, and we'll put pictures up on our social media. But so you made it past HolyKoolaid, but now
can I say real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I know hopefully you don't hate me for this, but I actually met this guy HolyKoolaid a number of years ago, around the time I first met you, actually, at a debate where Matt Slick debated Matt Dillahunty and David Smalley in the same weekend, and HolyKoolaid was there. This is before his channel kind of got as popular as it is now, and I actually presented to him one of the arguments I use for the existence of the soul via consciousness being immaterial. And first of all, this guy, he was quite a character to meet, and he started we just started talking in the parking lot, and he goes into this rant about Adam and Eve and God, and he ends his rant with, I'm not joking, screaming at the top of his lungs. You can see the veins in his neck popping out, saying, "Your God doesn't make sense. Your God is psychotic." I mean, yelling at me. And I just kind of stared at him, and I said, well, before we go there, let me ask you a question about something you said earlier. And then I gave him the argument demonstrating the immaterial of consciousness. And again, you go on my YouTube channel where basically properties of the brain are not the same as the properties of the mind. I showed him how they're different. And I say, if this is the case, that would mean that if consciousness exists, then it can't be physical. And as he already conceded to me that if atheism is true, only physical things exist. So I said, okay, so based on this, if consciousness exists, it can't be physical. And if it can't be physical, then on your own standards, atheism can't be true. I said, what do you have to say to that? And he looked at me and he said, I'm not exaggerating. He said, you know what? That's a great question. And I have an answer to that, but I really got to go. And I was like, well, just give me a quick answer. He's like, it would take too long, but I really got to go. Nice talking with you. I gave him my card and he stormed off. I would have loved to talk to him.
And that was, you're saying that was HolyKoolaid?
Yep.
Wow. Stories
yeah,
with
David
Eric.
Shepard was there, and yeah. Yeah, so anyways, go ahead.
All right. So you actually have personal interaction. So, but you've kind of responded to him here. You haven't you've totally responded here in a powerful way, but that's HolyKoolaid. Now we're moving on to world famous physicist, theoretical physicist, Sean Carroll, who many people think is one of either the only or one of the few guys to ever best William Lane Craig in debate. And so he has recently made this case that science has totally knocked this thing down. You've looked at his work a little bit. What do you have to say to this?
I think he's off in a lot of areas, and it would take a long time. In fact, I put up one of his articles in preparation for this, and there's just a lot of little points that we won't be able to go through all of them. And so I'm just going to give an overview. But I do want to recommend a few resources before we get into the responses here. If you can type it in Google, and you should be able to find it. It's Alvin Plantinga Against Materialism. Find that article. It's an incredibly great article where he's going to break down some of the stuff I will likely be touching on. And then there's also another article that someone sent to me, a friend of mine, on written about. So basically, Sean Carroll is going to bring up the interaction problem, like you kind of already alluded to. Well, in order for the soul to interact with something like electrons, it's going to have to break certain laws, and we know how these things work. And if you're going to say a soul interacts, you're either going to have to throw out these laws, or you're going to have to, or maybe it's just a case that there is no soul. And according to him, because he thinks it is physically impossible for the interaction problem to be possible, therefore there is no soul. That's just a non sequitur, first of all. But here's a paper written, Conservation Laws and the Philosophy of Mind, Opening the Black Box, Finding a Mirror, by J. Brian Pitts. And this goes into not just the philosophy of the interaction problem, but even goes into like some quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and even some possible scenarios that are well over my head, but they respond to a lot of that stuff here. Now back to Sean Carroll. First of all, his argument misses a lot of points. In fact, in some of the stuff he's saying, he says stuff like, first of all, there's a guy named Adam Frank who's an atheist and a colleague of Sean's, who basically says the question of the afterlife, because that's what Sean's attacking in the article. Sean says, when it comes to the afterlife, if it exists, then it's one of the most important things we can talk about. And then he says, and if science has something to say about it, then we should be all interested in hearing. Now, the first problem is he thinks science has anything to say with the existence of the soul and the afterlife. I'll say this. When it comes to your views of philosophy of mind, whatever view you hold to, it's going to be what's called empirically equivalent. Moreland explains this well in his book. Basically, something that is empirically equivalent is when you get, let's say, three different positions. You have substance dualism, property dualism, hylomorphism, physicalism. Pick whatever position you want. Whatever position you hold to, these positions are going to differ in their metaphysics, not in their physics, which means take myself and Sean Carroll. I'm a substance dualist. He holds to maybe some version of physicalism. No amount of scientific data can be presented to us that is going to make our view more or less plausible, because our views are not dependent on any kind of physical data. Nothing empirical is going to change our positions, because our positions are going to essentially be philosophical in nature, not physical. So nothing that you can present to us is going to add credibility to one position over the other. So they're empirically equivalent. That being said, he says that one of his colleagues thinks that science has nothing to say about this. And Sean just says, I think the guy's wrong. And what's interesting is, as an illustration, Sean says, because Adam Frank says we should be agnostic about this question, science has nothing to say about this, and he's right. But Sean says, well, what if someone were to say the moon is made of green cheese? Someone can go to the moon, sure, you can take rock samples, but what if you came back and I said, oh, well, you have to dig at least 10 feet under in order to get to the green cheese? He says, so you could be agnostic about anything. So he's basically trying to use a reductio, but this doesn't work because it's not the same thing. Because all I have to do is go back to the moon, dig a few feet deeper, however much he says, and says, okay, look, it's not made of green cheese. And he says, oh, but I could push back and say, okay, well, most of the moon is made of green cheese, so there might be some parts of the moon that's not. It becomes special pleading, because what you could eventually say is, look, we've studied 20% of the moon, and we at least know that 20% of the moon is not made of green cheese. So it's not analogous to the soul. Because the very thing that Adam Frank, this atheist colleague of Sean Carroll, points out is that there is no, it says here, that there is no verifiable information regarding life after death. There's no controlled experiment we can do. So for Sean to use an example like the moon, analogous to saying, well, we also can't do this with the moon. Yes, we can. It might be harder, but yes, we can. Now Sean says, but however, even though it's possible that the moon can be made of green cheese, which if he's saying that much, he's already conceding it's possible that there is life after death. So he's already conceding some points there, maybe without realizing it. Nevertheless, he's saying based on what we know about the moon, we can say it's not made of green cheese. And that's fine and dandy. And he says because when we look at other rocks and other planets, we know that they're not made of green cheese. I think there's a bit of a leap there, but here's the point. sure, you can say that, because what you can do is you can get a rock from the moon and a rock from the earth. You can compare like with like, but you can't use this illustration and use it as a point for the soul, because in order to say it's analogous, you would have to say, if I can get rocks and look at all these other rocks and see they're not made of green cheese, well, how can you do that with the soul? You can't say, well, this person has no soul because when I look at other souls, they're not X, Y, and Z. Well, it doesn't work that way. Now, what we can do, however, he is onto something, is we can look at other things that we know that exist that are immaterial, or other things we know about metaphysics. There are certain principles within metaphysics that do help us understand the nature of the soul. Because what Sean's going to do is say, there's no physical law that would explain this. And there's nothing in physics. If you're going to believe that a soul that's immaterial can interact with something like electrons, you're going to have to throw out the laws of physics. I'm saying, no, you don't have to throw out the laws of physics. You just have to leave the room of physics and open the door to the room of metaphysics. I mean, for him to miss that point to me is absurd, because he'll say things like, there's no spirit particles, or we haven't discovered any spirit atoms, or whatever. The point is, he's basically trying to reduce something that's supposed to be immaterial to something physical. The problem with that is, it's like the illustration I heard Greg Coco once give. Suppose you tell your neighbor that there's an invisible guy in your house, and your neighbor doesn't believe you. So you say, look, I promise you there's an invisible guy in my house. If you want, go check for yourself. So your neighbor says, okay, wait out here outside. I'm going to go in and investigate. Your neighbor goes in. An hour later comes back. He's really upset, and he says, Eric, you're a liar. I said, what do you mean? You told me there's an invisible guy in your house. I said, yeah, there is. I promise. He goes, well, you're lying. Well, why would you say that? Because, Eric, I just went into your house, and for 1 hour, I looked everywhere for this invisible man, and not once did I see him. I looked under the bed, I looked in the closet, I looked in the bathroom, and not once did I ever see this invisible person. Well, obviously, you would look at him kind of funny and say, well, yeah, it's because he's invisible. In other words, you can't hold it against an invisible man, the fact that he's not visible, and use it as an argument against his existence, when by definition, if he existed, he wouldn't be something visible. Now, obviously, this doesn't prove there is an invisible man, but it does prove that if you wanted to disprove the existence of an invisible man, you cannot appeal to your sense of sight for something that by definition cannot be seen. I think this is one of the big mistakes Sean is doing here. There's a lot more that can be said here, but basically when he looks at these things, he's begging the question that there would be some type of intermediate mechanism, that it would be something physically detectable, and then just says, given that we don't know anything like this, we basically have to say that since we're not going to go with the laws of physics, it must be the case that the soul doesn't exist. I'll say one more thing that I think he doesn't realize the sword cuts both ways. He basically talks about, let me see if I can find it. He says, here's an analogous line of reasoning that would come from evolutionary biology. Presumably, amino acids and proteins don't have souls that persist after death, because he's attacking life after death. What about viruses or bacteria? Whereupon the chain of evolution from our monocellular ancestors to today, did organisms stop being described purely as atoms interacting through gravity and electromagnetism and develop an immaterial soul? So he's basically saying, okay, you're going to say that, human beings have souls, but you're not going to apply it to this, this, or this. What's interesting here is he's probably inadvertently, not intentionally, given an argument for the immaterialness of consciousness, the irreducibility of consciousness. It's an argument I use in my debate with Matt Dillahunty. Go to the article that I mentioned about Ivan Planiga called Against Materialism, and he breaks this down very nicely. But in a nutshell, you look at something like intentionality, because like I said, the sword cuts both ways. Intentionality is a mental property, which has to do with ofness or aboutness. So, for example, when I am thinking about it's a beautiful day, my thought has the mental intentional state of being about the aesthetics of today. So my mental states have intentionality. When I'm hungry and I hunger for food, the intention is to try to find something to eat. When I say I'm hungry, I'm not saying my neurons are hungry. I'm not saying the left side of my brain is hungry. I'm saying I'm hungry. When I'm feeling sick, my neurons don't feel sick. I feel sick, which right away would give a distinction that I am not my brain or my neurons. Now, Plantinga goes further and alludes to Leibniz, where, again, I'm being very brief here because I know we're kind of running out of time. But put it this way. Take the most base particle you can think of, a quark. A quark cannot have something like a thought or belief. Okay, put thousands or billions of those together and move up the chain. And I don't have my notes in front of me, but let's say the next step is like, let's say atoms. And then you say, okay, now we put all these quarks together, now we have an atom. An atom still does not contain a thought or belief. Put a million billion of those together, now you have a cell. And then you keep going up. Eventually get to the point to where you get a neuron. Get one neuron. Does a neuron have a thought or belief? No. Okay, now let's get 100 billion of these and put these together. Now you have a brain. Presto, boom, now you have consciousness. In other words, it cuts both ways, because if you're going to say, oh, well, these viruses or bacteria or these proteins and amino acids don't have souls, at what point do they have souls? That's exactly the argument one would use, and someone like Plantinga and Leibniz would use, to show that these brain states cannot contain things like thoughts or beliefs, because if one neuron doesn't have it, 100 billion neurons aren't going to have it. And again, it's not as if adding and rearranging the furniture of my house gives me a new color on the gives me a new paint of color on my walls, because it's not that kind of a property. The brain is an aggregate. You don't put more together, rearrange the structure, and all of a sudden you get consciousness. So his argument, I think, at the end of the day, it's a category fallacy. It begs the question, and it actually defeats itself when you get to this part of the article.
Wow, 3 fallacies together, huh?
At least, yeah.
Well, listen, I'll tell you what. I was going to go through here and look for questions, and there were some that we didn't get to, but we did cover most of what was asked at some point or other. And so I don't, we've already gone so long. I don't know that we're going to keep going with this, but let me say a few things. First of all, really enjoyed this, Eric. It was very helpful. Secondly, I remember just after I debated Matt Dillahunty last year about this time, he said in the debate review that he was going to, he said, I think in the future what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue against the soul, or ask for somebody to provide me evidence of the soul, because if the soul doesn't exist, then Christianity is in big trouble. Well, and we affirm the existence of the soul. And we think it is very, very important to Christianity. But it's interesting that here lately we're seeing a rise in, or maybe not too much of a rise, but we are seeing a rise in literature regarding Christian physicalism. There are Christians out there who don't believe in a soul. And I've actually had arguments, me and Chris Date's a friend of mine who is a physicalist, who runs Rethinking Hell Ministries. We've had him on the channel. And we talked for 2 hours one night about this whole issue. But anyway, it's a really interesting subject. I do think that we have major problems if you don't believe in the soul. That runs into major problems, whatever your worldview, because it doesn't make sense of certain things that you need to have for livability, like the continuity of identity issue that we were talking about earlier. So, but we're not going to do any more questions. But I want to say this: if you've made it through this whole thing, then we don't give out pine points like Pine Creek does, but we give out prime points for Pritchett Prime. So you get 1,000 prime points for making it through this far. And hey, this was the first time that we've been trying this kind of software. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. And here's what I decided, Eric. I decided, the only way to make progress on YouTube, and when you have kind of, we've gotten to where we're not a huge channel, but we've got over 6,000 subscribers, 6,300, something like that. And so you get scared to try to do anything new that might cause you to have to stop and restart 4 or 5 times in one day. But today I just decided, nope, we're just going to push through and try it. And another thing is, right now, I don't know if we're going to live stream much. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do interviews and stuff and record those and then release those as videos going forward. Because for those of you out there listening, it seems like YouTube is throttling live stream notifications and things like that here lately. Several of us have noticed it. For example, it's weird. Yesterday I did a premiere. We had like 170 people in the premiere. Here we've had 30 something in here for this. And it may be just that the soul isn't that interesting, but I really don't think that's what it is. I think there's something going on, and several of us have noticed it.
It's my fault.
No, it's not your fault, Eric. It's not your fault. I think it's something to do. We think that YouTube, perhaps because of the lockdowns and us people staying at home, they don't have as many employees on it, so little quirks aren't getting fixed or something. But anyway, thank you for letting us do this experiment here, because this is so cool, and it's going to revolutionize how I do response videos. Being able to put the stuff, the videos in the live stream is so cool. And Eric, thank you for being willing to come on today. And people, go subscribe to Eric's channel. I know that there's going to be hundreds more that will see this after the stream is done. Go subscribe to Eric's channel, and also, hey, get some Trinity Radio merch here. The Trinity logo tee is pretty cool, I think, and that shirt you've got, Eric, the Jonathan Pritchett shirt, is probably the best selling thing that we've got, and you can get it by going to trinityradio.org and going to the resources page, and there's a link there. But Eric, any final thoughts?
No, it's just some apologies. Sorry for speaking fast. I do so naturally, and that's another long story, but I try to get as much as I can and still be respectful of people's time. But thank you so much just for having me on. Gosh, you're a brother in Christ and a friend, and I am honored to be able to say that. And okay, sorry. Okay, notification came up and I thought it stopped it.
But, I'm glad it did, because it messed up your flow, and I want you to get back into that flow in just a minute. But Daniel James Hull has asked me this 3 times during the stream, and so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you. So, and this may require you to go off a little bit. That's fine. It'll be the last thing we do, I promise everyone. But he asks, how do you get from the soul to God? So if can you make an argument from the existence of the soul to the existence of God?
Yeah, in a nutshell, it's going to be similar to Moreland's argument from consciousness, but basically alluding back to the panpsychist position, where the panpsychist says, look, we know that mind can't come from matter, but it's here, so we're going to have to bite the bullet and basically have to say it's always been here, so it didn't emerge from something. And if it's always been here, what's the best way to explain it? They punt, and I say punt intentionally, they punt to panpsychism, saying, well, maybe it's just always been here, and it just requires a certain set of physical conditions for it to activate, and consciousness is going to not necessarily appear because it's always been there, but it's going to be activated, and it's always had that potential in the first place. Now, what they're basically doing is trying to avoid the conclusion of God by saying, well, you can't get something from nothing. I mean, look at the Leibniz's argument, right? The contingency argument. Basically, if something exists now, there has to be something to explain its existence. And the panpsychist wants to say what's always been here within natural physical stuff. Well, replace that with God. And I say, why not go to that camp? Why punt to the panpsychist camp? And when you look at the argument from contingency, the way I use it at least, here's a nutshell version of my argument from contingency. Everything that exists is going to have an explanation, right? So how do I explain my existence? I'm contingent. Well, I can explain my existence by pointing to my parents. Okay, so I've sufficiently explained my existence, but then they're contingent. You have to keep going back. It'd be similar if I wrote a check to you and I said, here, Braxton, here's a $5 check. Don't cash it till tomorrow because I need to go get money. And then I give you the check. I go to somebody else, says, hey, I need $5. They give me a check, say don't cash it tomorrow. Eventually, if you keep doing this, by the time you cash a check, the money's not going to be there. Let's suppose all things being equal, you cash a check, it is there. Well, that would go to show that somewhere down the line, some person X met some person Y that didn't have to write a check but owned the money and gave it to the person for it to go down the line. We would call people who write these checks, Moreland calls them borrowing lenders. The person who had the money is an owning lender. He did not have to borrow. He owned and lended what he owned. Everybody else lended what they had to borrow. Take existence. Same rule applies. If I exist because of my parents, but they're contingent. Why do they exist? Their parents, they're contingent. At some point, much like the check analogy, if all you get are borrowing lenders, you're going to get blank checks, the check's going to bounce. But if I do exist, it follows that at somewhere down the line, there was an owning lender with respect to existence that has always existed, necessarily a self-existence, and whose existence did not depend on something external to himself, namely God. Apply the same line of logic with the soul. If souls and minds and consciousness exist and they're not physical, and we can't get them from matter, apply the same line of logic. It therefore follows that ultimate fundamental reality had to have come from something fundamental that is ultimate to reality, namely an unembodied mind, a big soul, the biggest soul you can think of, namely God.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. And we will shut it down now. And Eric, you've got a couple of debates coming up, one with Owen Younger at the Bible and Beer Consortium, and then one with Aaron Raw. So, folks, make sure to check those out. And again, Eric, any final thoughts?
Bring it.
Bring it. All right. All right, folks. Thanks for showing up for the live stream, and we'll see you next time on Trinity Radio. That would have been so dramatic if I could have just shut it off there, but I can't.